So how do we know enough about the old Indo-European languages to confidently talk about when they reached different parts of the world, when they started to be recorded, what their old forms are like, how old they are, and how we can use them as a basis for comparison, comparative reconstruction in order to understand the structure of what must have come before them. This presentation is about the oldest records of our Indo-European languages. Not all of them, of course, but some of the most significant ones. As you remember, our best explanation for how the various groups of languages indicated by these colored splotches on the map relate to each other is that they all come from one original source, which we call Proto-Indo-European, which was somewhere there in the Ukraine, roughly, and has since spread out and diverged into that blue Indic and Indo-Iranian language family, the Slavic languages in the dark green area, the Baltic languages of Latvian and Lithuanian in the light green area, the Germanic languages, the Celtic languages, the Romance languages, and so forth. I don't think we have a special spot for Tocharian there. It must be... Perhaps it must be that little light blue spot somewhere there in Uzbekistan. But on down, you remember that their archaeological record accords with what we can deduce from vocabulary, that this culture and its language began to move around Europe by 4000 BC and then to spread probably in these areas. And we remember about the Roman Empire and the movements of the Germanic languages. So we know that it's been quite a long time that these cultures have been distinct. And so here's a tour. It happens that Hittite, which was used in what is now Turkey, the Anatolia is the oldest recorded Indo-European language. And we have cuneiform inscriptions on clay tablets, and in some cases carved into rock, from a royal library that persist and was dug up in 1909, translated around by 1919. This is an important fact that this is the oldest attested Indo-European language. Probably some fragments are as old as 2000 BC. And it's also one of the most recently discovered ones. It wasn't deciphered until 1919. That allowed an interesting sort of experiment to happen. By that point, the idea of Proto-Indo-European reconstruction was already very well advanced, and a lot of hypotheses had been advanced about, what kinds of sounds had to have existed, but we had no record of. And then once Hittite was deciphered, it was found that some of those sounds, in fact, existed in Hittite texts. Now, you're going to say, good grief, how do you know? Maybe you just found the thing you were actually looking for. It's confirmation bias, right? Well, we know quite a bit about Hittite phonetics because they borrowed their writing system from the Akkadians from the Babylonian Empire. And that one's much better understood. So we could tell they're using the Akkadian letters for certain kinds of sounds, because they're also borrowing Akkadian words and Akkadian names and things. And it confirms that these phonemes existed in the Hittite language, in the early Indo-European languages, that had only been posited to be there on the basis of historical reconstruction. So that increases our confidence somewhat. There's a growing body of deciphered Hittite literature if you decide to get into that sort of thing. Another one of the most ancient recorded Indo-European languages is Sanskrit, particularly in the early form we call Vedic, which is named Vedic after the religious texts that preserve it. So these are some of the foundational texts of what becomes Hinduism. Here you've got it in a relatively modern script. I think this is a 19th century manuscript. So it's not that old, but it's a really, really old text from probably around 1500 BC. One of the reasons we know that this is old is that there was a long tradition of ancient Sanskrit grammar. And so we have Sanskrit grammar texts from, say, 1000 BC that are well dated against the historical record, who are and those grammarians in those texts are doing things like quoting old literature and saying, look how old this stuff is. Here's how it works. This is how it's different from ours. So we're actually able to date these things fairly confidently. This is a copy of part of the Avesta. This is a part of a prayer book, and you'll notice that the note there is pretty complicated. The manuscript is from 1323. It's very well dated, and it's from medieval Persia, which is now Iran. But the text is probably from between 1500 to 300 BC, and parts of it are as old as 1500 BC. Here again, if you're good at reading Pahlavi or Avestan, you can tell that this document is a piece of commentary on an older text, and so there are passages where people writing in the language of 1323 Persia are commenting on the language of much more ancient Persia and quoting it back and forth and back and forth. This is part of this works because of the way religious texts are conserved. People resist updating the language of their religion, of the books that reveal their faith to them. The Avestas, by the way, are the part of the sacred texts of Zoroastrianism, which is now a minority religion in parts of Iran, the Middle East, and India, and regions in between. But prior to the spread of Islam in the 7th century, was a major religion in what's now Iran and the areas surrounding it. This is the oldest known inscription in Latin, the Duenos inscription. It's on this interesting little vessel, and you can tell that it's evidently either magical or humorous, and it's something about the act of drinking and wishing for good things. We don't get the prestigious Latin literature, the so-called Golden Age, until several hundred years after this, when the growth of the Roman Empire leads to lots of inscriptions all over the place, the spread of literacy, the preservation of long literary texts from, say, the 2nd century BC. Here is the oldest alphabetic record of Greek. There are other records of the Greek language in other writing systems, but this is the Dipylon inscription that's been very confidently dated, and it's scratched onto a wine jug, and it says something about how the best dancer gets to drink from this. Now, we know there was already a literary tradition and storytelling tradition going on there. The Homeric poetry is from not too long after this, from around the same period, really. And we have a few fragmentary inscriptions of Homeric poetry that may be not much younger than this. But of course, the problem is that's a very long text if you think about the Aeneid. Here's one of the oldest physical copies of the Aeneid. It's a papyrus document that's housed in the British Library. And we can take a closer look. This is from around the year AD 150. Here it is. And it was recovered in Egypt. Papyrus lives pretty well if you bury it in the Egyptian desert, but it survives very poorly in temperate climates. So most ancient texts from the Mediterranean world that were written on papyrus just don't survive in original copies, or in fact even in ancient copies. They survive in medieval copies made on parchment, which is very durable, as opposed to papyrus. Nevertheless, if your ancient Greek is good, and you can read around this lacuna, these are lacunae, holes in it, you can tell that this is the final book, book 24 of the Aeneid, and it picks up around line 127 where Thetis comes down and sits with Achilles to tell her son how it's going to be. They have a little bit of a tough talk there. So you can peruse that. We know enough about the textual history of Homer, the so-called Homeric poetry, to know that these epics are really very ancient, and from hundreds of years prior to this, from probably the 7th, 8th century BC, we get references and inscriptions here and there, but old copies, big copies, don't survive very well from before, say, the 3rd century AD, when people start writing more on parchment, which lasts. Oh, where was my? There it is. Oh, blast! Slideshow. Oh, you got to be kidding me. There we are. But what about the Germanic languages? The Germanic tribes really aren't writing back in that era, but by the beginning of the current era, by the 1st, 2nd century AD, Germanic tribes have had enough contact with literate Greek-speaking peoples and Roman-speaking, that is Latin-speaking peoples, that they begin to write too and develop an alphabet called the runic alphabet, or the Futhark, that's partially based on probably Etruscan and also Latin letters. Etruscan, by the way, isn't part of the mix. It's not Indo-European. But here is the oldest firmly datable runic inscription in a Germanic language, and it is a comb. The inscription in runes reads Harya, and Harya means this is for your hair. It's a form of the noun hair that means of the hair, which just is a helpful thing to write on a comb, I guess. But we've got it. This is found in the context of some other things in an archaeological dig on the island of Vimos in Denmark, and you can look all those up if you want. This sort of fragmentary runic inscription is the first sort of writing we've get. And by the way, that one is old enough that it and a few others may be from the stage that we call Proto-Germanic in the language. And if not that, then it's on the border between that and what we would think of as Proto-Norse. That is the northern version of Proto-Germanic, as it's on its way to becoming the Scandinavian languages. Gothic is also being written down during those Roman times, and here you've got a spearhead with Gothic runes on it. Notice that they read from right to left, and this reads Tillarids, which in Gothic, til is towards, and rids is it rides, or it goes. So this is an inscription that labels the spear as a thing that heads towards its target. It's the to-goer. It's the true striker, if you want to think of it that way. You'll notice we've got a drawing, or perhaps an early photograph here. The original one was dug up in... Anyway, these things don't last well. The original one was dug up in the Ukraine and eventually lost sometime during or by the end of World War II. Whether it wound up in private hands and was looted someplace, or whether it was just destroyed in the war is unknown. But it didn't take long for people in speaking these Germanic languages to develop their own writing systems. The oldest Germanic language that leaves a substantial written record is Gothic, the language of the Goths. In the aftermath of the Roman Empire, they set up some kingdoms in northern Italy and northeastern Spain, centered on Ravenna and Barcelona, respectively. And there they maintained a very civilized culture, including learning and literature. The only Gothic texts to speak of that we have are fragments of a biblical translation and some other little bits and pieces. There's nothing we'd think of as particularly literary or native Gothic. This is a monumental Bible, probably made for the court of King Theodoric in the 500s. We know from the historical record that the Gothic translation of the Bible was probably from the mid 300s. We also know when this manuscript was probably made, substantially later. The alphabet is influenced by Greek, you'll notice here. That's where the Goths got evangelized from and learned how to write. And there's a fun story about that. A person named Wulfilas gets credit for this translation. Anyway, he's an important figure in their history, and he was part of a missionary effort by the Greeks to Christianize the Goths and maybe try to settle them down a little bit. And part of that, of course, means translating the Bible into Gothic out of Greek, by the way, not out of Roman, out of Latin. And according to Jordanes, the historian of the Goths, he translated, and his team, I presume, translated the entire Bible into Gothic except for the 2 books of Kings, because the Goths were already good enough at war and they didn't need any spiritual license to do more of it. So there you go. This, by the way, is, yes, you'll notice the parchment is purple. This is a royal Bible, and you're looking at part of the book of Mark there. This is Mark 3:27, and at the very top, Niman namag kasas, and so forth. This is, nobody can go into a strong man's house and tie him up. That bit, if you're familiar with Mark. Old English is first written in runic form, as you'll remember, probably in the 400s, probably roughly contemporaneously with Gothic. You know, after all, the ancestors, the early Old English speakers, were also in touch with the late Roman Empire and its aftermath. But we start getting a more developed textual culture as they develop a Christian church later on, and our earliest records include things like glossaries of Latin words. And in this, on the left-hand phrase, you'll see there are a lot of hard and obscure and rare Latin words on the left, and they are glossed, that is, translated with less hard and obscure Latin words on the right, more ordinary, everyday Latin words here on the right. So, unlike people in Southern Europe, people in Northern Europe who spoke Germanic languages had a lot of work to do learning how to use literary Latin as well as spoken Latin. And that's what this is partly a record of. But also, this is partly in Old English. Up here we see the word abelena, and whoever knew that word didn't know a different Latin word for it, so use the English word haselnutu, which is hazelnut, which is a nice one. And here we have absinthium. He didn't know what absinthium was, and so this person wrote wermod, which has turned into the modern English wormwood, which is a bitter herb. And of course now in modern English we have both the name of the herb and the name of a beverage flavored with it, absinthe. So I think that's all the Old English I see on this page. There's quite a bit more. This goes on for a long time. The so-called Epinal Erfurt glossary, which was left on the continent. It was discovered in the Low Countries, and it was probably left there by Old English-speaking missionaries who went to evangelize their Germanic-speaking neighbors in Northern Europe in the early Middle Ages. It's now resides in Cambridge, of course. So there you go. Incidentally, the text of Beowulf probably dates from within decades of this, probably from right about AD 700, and we know this because of the kinds of copying errors that exist in the current manuscript, even though the current manuscript very clearly dates from about 300 years later, from the decade right after the year 1000 is when our current copy is from. But again, because of the kinds of scribal errors that are made in it, we can tell people were copying it who were reading handwriting that was back from this era of circa 700. So there is a tour of some of the oldest written records of Germanic languages and the oldest written records of the Indo-European languages. You can see there's quite a gap there. If our earliest confident records of Germanic languages are from, say, 200 AD in runic inscriptions, but we've got texts in Hittite from 1700 BC or even a little older. If we want to reconstruct Indo-European, we not only need to have a broad body of evidence drawn from lots of different Indo-European languages, we also have to make sure we're reaching back into the oldest available texts, or at least finding the oldest available features of the language if they happen to be written down in later copies.